Hey everybody, welcome back to Communication Studies with Miss Mang, Public Speaking Edition. Today we are going to be talking about the importance of listening. So to jump things off, let's make one very clear and important distinction, and that is that listening and hearing are two very different things. The difference between listening and hearing is that hearing is just when the actual sound waves enter your eardrum. And so when you are hearing the actual sounds, that is hearing. Now, listening, on the other hand, is when you put meaning behind those sounds that are going into your ears. So you creating meaning out of the messages that are sent to you, that is the difference between listening and hearing. For example, if you are a deaf person, you are not able to hear because that is the physical entering of sound waves into your ears. But if you are a deaf person, you are still able to listen because you are receiving messages and you're interpreting those messages to mean something. So now that we understand the distinction between listening and hearing, we can jump right in. Now there are a bunch of different types of listening. The first type of listening is appreciative listening. This is the easiest type of listening. So if you're listening to your favorite band or the radio, or you're listening to a podcast you enjoy, or a book on tape, all of those things are appreciative listening. Next up is relational listening. Relational listening is what you do when you are communicating interpersonally with another individual. So if you're in relationship with someone, if it's a friendship, a familial relationship, or a significant other, the things that they say to you are really important for you to listen to, and doing that type of listening, that's going to be relational listening. So like, for example, if your significant other came home from work and had a really hard day and they were telling you all about it, you listening to them talk about their day counts as relational listening. Anytime you're doing relational listening, you are building up and contributing to the relationship and strengthening that relationship. Just like you feel like you need to be listened to, the people that you are in relationship with also need to be listened to. Now, this is not as easy as appreciative listening, but it is still pretty much on the easier scale of types of listening to do. Next is empathetic and therapeutic listening. Empathetic and therapeutic are really the same thing. If you think about the name, empathetic or therapeutic, you might think that it sounds like the word therapy. And yes, you would be right. So counselors and therapists often employ this type of listening. It's when someone has a problem or needs to get something off their chest or is struggling and needs to talk, and you are the person who is listening to that, and you are kind of being empathetic and you are helping them to sort through their issues. That is empathetic or therapeutic listening. Now, you can see at the example that I gave right before this about your significant other having a hard day, how relational listening and empathetic and therapeutic listening sometimes cross over and get a little bit blurred. And that's okay. You can do two different types of listening at the same time. So if you have a friend who's going through a hard time, maybe she's going through a breakup, and she comes and she talks to you about how she's feeling and all the things that are going on with her, that is not only relational listening, but is also empathetic/therapeutic listening as well. Empathetic and therapeutic listening does not have to be tied to relational listening. It can just be on its own. Think back to the therapist who doesn't really have any relationship with their client, just that they are there to help them sort through their issues. The next type of listening is critical listening. Critical listening is what happens when there's a message that's being given and you're trying to think through that message and see whether you agree or disagree or whether there are flaws within that message. Think about right now in the news, there's a lot going on. right? You're getting different messages from different news sources. So when you're listening to the news, you will need to be critically listening because you don't know what news source has the truth or what news source has fake news or even something that's distorted or not up to date. So when you are critically listening, you are listening very, very closely to what is being said so that you can discern the truth from within the message. You also might see this when a person is running to be elected. When they're giving a speech, you might listen to that speech really closely because you are trying to discern whether you align yourself with that candidate and whether they're saying things that concern you or they're saying things that you think would be good for a person running for that position. Critical listening is harder than all the ones that we have said before because it takes a lot of effort and a lot of focus while you are listening. The final type of listening is informational listening, and this is something that you are very well accustomed to because it is when you are trying to soak up as much information as possible. This happens all the time when you are in class and you are listening to a lecture. When you are listening to a lecture, you are doing informational listening. You're trying to soak up all that information because you want to know how to do well in the class, how to pass the exams, etc. And this is one of the most difficult types of listening because it takes a lot of energy for you to really actively listen and not just tune out the information that's being told to you and really try and soak it in and remember that information in the future. Now you might be thinking, okay, Miss Ming, like you just told me a bunch of different types of listening, but why are we even talking about listening in a public speaking class? Well, if you are a public speaker, you are also probably an audience member in lots of different contexts. And when you are an audience member, you need to have good listening skills, particularly in this class. You're learning not just how to get up in front of the class and speak and create speeches, but you're also learning how to listen and how to evaluate your classmates and other people while they are giving speeches. If you are able to listen properly, then you will be able to evaluate what information that you're being given is true or false, which is a very good skill to have, but you'll also be able to help other people to increase and elevate their own public speaking skills as well. So let's talk about the value of listening. There is value in listening across the board in many different contexts. For example, in class, if you are a good listener, you're going to be able to retain information better and do well academically across your classes. Having good listening skills doesn't just help in a public speaking class, it helps in your science class, in your art classes, in your activities that you're doing. All of those things will benefit from good listening skills. Next, at work, listening is very important because the better you listen, the more you are going to be able to follow your boss's directions and not just listening to what your boss specifically tells you, but also listening to all the different things that are happening like in the workplace, and being able to be attentive across the board is going to make you a better, more effective worker. In fact, many scholars call listening the most critical business skill of all. There's a concept in communication studies called the communication loop. And what this demonstrates is that all of us are both senders and receivers, meaning we all send messages and we receive messages. You might remember that from the transactional model of communication that we learned earlier in the semester. However, without effective listening, then that communication loop cannot exist. Because without effective listening, we aren't able to respond to messages that we receive. Additionally, constructive feedback is only possible with effective listening. You can't give feedback on a message unless you really listen to what that message is saying to you. So listening is very, very important. So now let's talk about active listening. In order to be an active listener, you need to have attention and approach. So let's talk about both of those. In order to be an active listener, you have to be actually paying attention to the person that is speaking to you. That means not being on your phone. That means giving proper eye contact. That means really engaging with what they are saying. If you're not giving them attention and demonstrating that you're giving them attention, then you are not properly listening. Because listening is not just about the information and what you are soaking in at the moment. It is also about the perspective of the person who is speaking. They need to know that you are listening, and you demonstrate you are listening by giving proper attention. So by giving good eye contact and by giving nonverbal feedback and really helping them to know that their message is important enough for you to really listen to. The next part of active listening is approach. Now, when you are approaching a scenario in which you may have to listen or you will be listening, you need to make sure that you are in the correct mindset to actually be listening and paying full attention. So if you come into a scenario and you already have preconceived notions that something is going to be boring or that you don't like a specific person, you are going to have a really hard time listening to them. So for example, if I was to go to a lecture and I thought, oh no, I hate this class, this lecture is so boring, then I'm not going to actually be an active listener because my approach is all wrong. So let's talk about some barriers to effective listening. The first barrier to effective listening is anticipating. Now, I'm sure that you have done this before. Anticipating is when someone is talking and you think, oh, I know what they're going to say next. So you just assume that they're going to say whatever you think they're going to say next. So someone saying, hey, let's go, and you think, oh, they're going to say, let's go to eat right now. And you're like, yeah, sure. And you interrupt them. Well, you are anticipating what that person is going to say. It is a big problem because they might not actually be about to say whatever you think they're going to say. They might surprise you. The next barrier to effective listening is attitude, and this goes right along with the approach. So when you are going into a listening scenario, you need to kind of do a little self-regulation and see if your attitude is open and willing to actually listen. So like, for example, if you dislike one of your teachers, then you might have a preconceived notion that like, this is gonna be annoying, I don't wanna listen to them talk. So your attitude going into the scenario will actually be a barrier for you to listen to the information that you're being taught. Next is judging and jumping to conclusions. This is when a person is talking and they say something that sounds off or problematic, and once you hear those things, you jump to a conclusion about what they mean or who they are as a person, and you kind of stop listening to them because you're invalidating their whole argument and everything that they're saying. Sometimes we jump to conclusions when we are listening to someone's message because they say something that alarms us or triggers us or makes us feel like they are a bad person or that their message is not legitimate. And so we stop listening to what they have to say, when in reality, this is a barrier to listening, and we need to listen to them full out and give them the opportunity to really say what they're trying to say before we jump to conclusions and before we judge them. The last barrier to effective listening is reacting emotionally. This is when we get all hyped up and we react with intense emotions. So whether it's anger or fear or sadness or disappointment, and we just react with those, and those emotions often blur our ability to fully listen to the message that we are listening to. So now that we talked about barriers to effective listening, let's talk about strategies to enhance listening. The first one is to keep an open mind. The more open that your mind is when you go into a listening scenario, the more likely you are to really gain what the speaker means with what they're saying from their message. The second is to be focused and to be alert. When you are focused and alert, you're capable of listening more effectively. So, for example, if you are in class and you find yourself falling asleep a lot, what you can do is you can lift up one of your legs. And when you lift up one of your legs, you prevent yourself from actually falling asleep, which is a good tactic. For example, I tend to pinch myself, or I'll try and do something physically that will keep me more alert. If I need coffee, I get myself coffee, because the more alert I am, the better listener that I am. The next strategy is to identify and prevent distractions. So if you're in a listening environment and you figure out oh my gosh, I'm not listening well, and it is because I am so hungry, my stomach keeps growling, then you want to identify oh, I'm not listening because my stomach is growling, and find a way to solve the problem. Maybe you could get a snack and come back to the listening scenario. So whatever is happening, try and identify those things. That way it's not oh, I'm a bad listener, but more I have these distractions that are inhibiting me from listening, and let me try and solve for those distractions. The last one is to come prepared and take notes. Now this is true for some situations, but not all. So obviously it's context related. If you're coming to class, come prepared to class. Come prepared to listen and take notes in class. If you are interacting with your boss and your boss is giving you a lot of important information, maybe you want to write that information down. Find ways to enhance your listening, because I have a lot of students who say, oh, Miss Meng, I'm just a bad listener. And here's the thing, you might just inherently be a bad listener, but there are things that you could do to enhance your listening capabilities. And really, it's up to you as a person. You have to find what works best for you and put those into action. Now that we know ways to enhance our listening skills, let's talk about strategies that we can use to enhance other people listening to us as speakers. The first one is to write for the ear and not for the eye. Now, what this means is if you are writing a speech and if you are writing an essay, those two should not look the same. They should not sound the same. If you've ever heard a speech that's very, very droning on, it might be because that person was writing as if they were writing a paper instead of writing to engage as a speaker with the audience. The next is to find identity. So not only are you finding your identity within the words that you are speaking to your audience, but you're also finding ways that your audience can identify with your topic and with you. So if you have common identities with your audience, you want to capitalize on those identities and those commonalities, because finding those commonalities is going to enhance their ability to listen, because they will be more interested naturally by what you're saying. And this is all about finding common ground with your audience and goes right back to audience analysis. The more time that you spend getting to know your audience, the more effective you're going to be at creating a message that your audience will be interested in enough to listen actively to. And finally, when you are speaking, be conversational. Now, what does that mean? Be conversational. When we get up and we talk in front of a group, oftentimes we think that we have to speak in a different way. We have to have more poise. We have to be more structured. We have to be more aloof. And while some of those are true, they should all be done with an air of conversationalism, which means the audience feels like you are just talking to them. Because the less barriers that you can have between you and the audience, the more engaged your audience is going to be able to be with you. And one way to do that is to talk to them as if they are a group of your friends and you really want to communicate your message to them. So now let's talk about providing feedback to speakers. There is both verbal feedback and nonverbal feedback. And under both of those, there's both positive and negative feedback. So let's talk first about verbal feedback. When you're in the audience, verbal feedback might sound a little bit like this. Mm-hmm, yeah, uh-huh, I get it. So any sort of verbal, out loud response you're giving to the speaker is verbal feedback. Now this can be positive and negative. Positive feedback might be, awesome, yeah, okay, go off. Anything that you say that's positive, that encourages the speaker, is going to be positive verbal feedback. Negative verbal feedback would be, for example, if someone was to boo you off stage, that would be negative verbal feedback. Or groans in the audience, all of those negative verbal feedback. So now let's talk about non-verbal feedback. So with non-verbal feedback, you can do many different things to encourage or discourage the speaker with your non-verbals. And I'm sure you can easily think of ways to encourage a speaker. You could give someone a thumbs up. You could nod and give them that encouragement that way. You could lean in and really show that you're interested. You could clap or like fake clap, like it's like a golf clap. You can tell that your audience is really getting on with what you're saying. On the opposite end of that, with nonverbal negative feedback, this would be if people are in the audience falling asleep, or if they're making faces like, or like any sort of negative, like lame, like any negative thing that you're giving back to the speaker is nonverbal negative feedback. So now you can implement positive and negative verbal and nonverbal feedback when you are the audience member to ensure that the speaker knows that you are effectively listening. And that's listening. Thank you for watching this episode of Communication Studies with Miss Meng. I hope you learned lots about listening, and I will see you next time.